Our final guest on this listening tour of America will help us understand the societal, political, and historical ramifications of where we find ourselves today. Dr. Peniel Emmaus Joseph is the Barbara Jordan Chair, and I should say Barbara Jordan is awesome. She's so lucky to have this chair, and founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy at the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Peniel, so glad to meet you, and thank you for joining us today in our listening tour, right, to listen to her. Let me just start with the fact that you know, I've been interviewing someone I have a lot of respect for, Dr. Reverend William Barber of the Poor People's Campaign. And I've done now, I think, 3 interviews with him and looked at his interaction, you know, and he's very candid. You know, he's played a role in the inauguration activities, but he said, look, we don't just automatically sign up for the Biden campaign. We don't automatically sign up for these people. We want to see results for people in the street, not just for the black community. There are people that are having trouble all across the board. He's a very, very inclusive guy in what he thinks about what needles need to be moved and pushed. And I sort of like that. And so I want to ask you, you know, in the spirit of Dr. Barber, whom I really respect your work as well. And I should mention, everyone, read his book, The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, named one of Time Magazine's 100 most read books of 2020. So let's push that out there. But what would you think to make this a real moment about what can change for Americans and what you expect from the Biden administration? What do they need to hear?
Well, I think it's an all of the above strategy, and we've been hearing it so far. A lot of this is related to COVID-19 and the pandemic, and there's a massive economic recession and crisis happening right here, but that's disproportionately impacting communities of color. And I saw the last panel, indigenous activists were very, very eloquent about that fact. So it's a few things. It's passing this $1.9 trillion stimulus package, which the administration says would lift 40% of Latinos out of poverty, 33% of African Americans out of poverty. It's really having some kind of universal basic income program in the United States, irrespective of race. It's passing voting rights legislation, John Lewis Voting Rights Act. It's really investing more in terms of housing affordability and food justice and racial desegregation, both in terms of housing, but also neighborhoods and public schools. For healthcare, you know, Medicare for all, or some kind of guaranteed national healthcare system would help everyone, especially those who are very, very poor. And then finally, 2 things: climate change and the criminal justice system. Climate change is an existential crisis that impacts all of us. The criminal justice system, as we've seen with George Floyd's murder and the Black Lives Matter protest in 2020, really represents a gateway to panoramic systems of oppression that disproportionately impact Black people and communities of color. And we saw that in the aftermath of the white supremacist insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th. If we just see the way in which the white supremacist racial terrorists have been treated after desecrating the Capitol, in contrast, at times peaceful demonstrators, you see that we have 2 tiers of justice in this country that has to dramatically change. So it needs President Biden and Vice President Harris, they need an all of the above strategy. And so far, less than a week into the administration, that's what we're seeing.
Let me ask you, you raised the Black Lives Matter protests after George Floyd's murder, and there are honestly many other murders out there. And, you know, again, I'm speaking subjectively. My sense is that the conversation has changed from being one about what do we do about police brutality, what do we do about, you know, the way officers were trained and, you know, getting an equation of social justice right in a community, to something about what the Black Lives Matter protests did. I mean, somehow it's turned into the marchers and the protests as opposed to there. After, you know, some of the protests began, I interviewed former Governor Chris Christie about Camden, New Jersey. And he said, you know, in Camden, New Jersey, we had a real problem. We had a rotten police department. We had to take it down, you know, to the bottom. We had to get rid of a lot of officers. We had to create retraining. Val Demings I had on shortly after, she said the same thing. I don't know about you, but my sense is I don't see any of that going on. Do you see much movement about the fundamental issue that was driving a lot of the concern about, you know, the way police are trained, about the holds, about racism in departments, and about training?
Well, yes, the more radical investing in communities rather than investing in police. Sometimes people call it defund the police. They just really mean reimagining public safety. We've seen at the local level in terms of even in my hometown here of Austin, Texas.
So you see progress in that?
Yes, there's been progress at the local level, reallocation. But what we haven't seen is the massive criminal justice reform that we would need. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act doesn't go far enough, but it would take more steps. President Biden is going to be announcing a national commission to study, but we need more than that. We've been having studies of police since 1919, at least, when there was a riot, a white riot in Chicago that murdered scores of Black people. And the police sided with the white rioters and also murdered Black people. So that was the first time we had a real commission or study. And since then, we've had studies, the McCone Report after the Watts Rebellion in 1965. We had the Kerner Commission under President Johnson, which said the society was white, Black, separate, hostile, and unequal, and blamed the urban riots and rebellions on systemic racism. We've had reports after Rodney King in 1992 and after Ferguson in Baltimore in 2015. So this has to end. So we need congressional action. I think part of what's happening in the country is we've seen our democratic institutions failing us. So we need reform even within the institutions, the Senate and the filibuster. There's so much in the way in which Americans are being held hostage. They passed a $2 trillion stimulus for big business when the pandemic started, but they didn't pass it for ordinary working people and the homeless. And it's the same under Trump. The tax cuts were a massive giveaway to the wealthiest corporations and the wealthiest people in the United States at the expense of the poor. And that's what Reverend Barber talks about as well. So we've seen some headway, but we need a lot more. I think the positive of the Biden-Harris administration is that they recognize the catastrophic crisis that we're in, because we're really in a crisis between race, inequality, democracy, and white supremacy. And the only way you can temper that crisis is by centering racial justice and really by trying to eradicate systemic racism, defeat white supremacy that we see flourishing to the detriment of all of us, because the assault on the nation's capital is an assault on all of us who are Americans.
Peniel, when I was at The Atlantic, one of my colleagues was Ta-Nehisi Coates. He wrote an incredibly powerful piece calling for reparations for slavery, and that you know, when it came to assets, when it came to the long line of bigotry, systemic racism in finance and home ownership and voting, all of these things, so we need reparations. So where are you on reparation? And do you think there is a difference, a line between, you know, I don't know what to call it, but the easy low-hanging fruit for the Biden administration of saying, hey, we're not, you know, we're not racist, we're going to think about all this stuff, and something big like reparations?
Well, I think certainly they're centering racial justice and trying to make the federal government and all its agencies do racial data audits and to be anti-racist, which is great. I'm for reparations. I think we should have by executive order, a national racial truth, justice and healing commission, where the truth means that we get our story straight finally so we can share with our kids the grandeur and the travails of American democracy. We've been bogged down in the myths of American exceptionalism and having to lie about ourselves as a country for far too long. This country has been based on two big lies. The first lie was during antebellum racial slavery that said that Black people were this species of property. They were legal contraband that white people could own in perpetuity forever. The Supreme Court said the same thing in the Dred Scott case in 1857. 700,000 Americans had to die to turn the corner on that lie. Unfortunately, from Reconstruction to the present, we've doubled down on a second big lie, which is that the first one never happened. So we say things like affirmative action, or even the Freedmen's Bureau during Reconstruction after racial slavery was some kind of special privilege rather than public policy to actually guarantee and achieve Black citizenship and dignity. So when we think about racial truth, getting our story straight, justice is what? Policies. president has done executive orders. Those are great. They're not enough. We need legislation. What I loved about Biden today was he was reminding me of LBJ. LBJ is the last president that we've had. He's not perfect. He was flawed. But the Great Society is an important grand vision. FDR had the same thing with the four freedoms, right? So when we think about where we're at today, executive orders are going to be very, very important, but we need the massive kind of legislation that we saw with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, much of which has been lost because of the Shelby Holder decision of 2013. So the positive is that Biden is thinking big, but what we're seeing is that our democratic system in Congress might be too broken to actually legislate the will of the people. 81 million people wanted the Biden-Harris administration, biggest number of popular votes in American history, and that was despite voter suppression, especially targeted and weaponized against Black people. We have the Supreme Court that's 6-3 because Republicans weaponized the filibuster and deprived Merrick Garland and Democrats of a rightful seat on the court. All of that matters. So what Biden's trying to do is sort of prove that democracy is not broken, but we have one major party, the GOP, that is not interested in voting rights, that is not interested in democracy, that is siding with insurrectionists and siding with treason publicly and white supremacy. So we're in trouble nationally, despite the warm feelings about the inauguration, because it's very difficult to have a democracy where half the voting population wants authoritarian fascism. So it's very, very difficult. But the positive is that Biden is at least thinking big, and the press conference he did today talking about racial justice and centering racial justice. And if we can do that, that lifts us all up was spot on. And that's sort of the best words president has said about this since Lyndon Johnson.
Very powerful. I mean, I mentioned earlier, my computer's been popping all day with these new executive statements, executive memoranda, of course, the executive order across a whole variety of different race and identity issues. Just very quick, I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you'll come back. But I look at these as an opportunity. We don't all know everything about each other. That's why I wanted to have a listening tour. But you're the Barbara Jordan Chair, and I don't know if everybody knows Barbara Jordan, but I want them to have an opportunity. Will you please tell our audience about how awesome Barbara Jordan was?
Well, Barbara Jordan is the first Black woman to represent the South, 1972 election, 1973 to 79 in U.S. Congress. She was the first Black woman to be a Texas state legislator starting in 1966 from Houston. She taught for 17 years at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, where I teach from 1979 to 1996 rather. And really her big piece of co-sponsored legislation is the 1975 voting rights extension. And what that did is include Latinos, Asian Pacific Islanders, folks who were minority language but predominant in their own locales. You had to give them voting rights and access as well. And that extension puts Texas under the VRA in the Southwest from 1975 to 2013. And of course, very famously, Barbara Jordan has the eloquent and elegant words, both at the 1974 Watergate hearings, where she talks about her faith in the Constitution, how it's whole, it's complete, and she wouldn't allow the Nixon administration to desecrate the Constitution. And she becomes the first Black keynote speaker at a major party political convention in 1976. Barbara Jordan paves the way for Barack Obama. She paved the way for Kamala Harris. She paves the way for modern Black elected officials who are interested in racial justice and democracy, who believe in voting rights, and who believe in the promise of America at its very, very best. So Barbara Jordan is one of the heroic freedom fighters of the 20th century whose legacy continues to reverberate, not just in Texas, but nationally.
Thank you for that. I'm so glad you shared that about the great Barbara Jordan. So Dr. Peniel Joseph, the Barbara Jordan Chair and Founding Director of the Center for Study of Race and Democracy at UT Austin, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you'll be back.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that brings us to the end of our program today. What a great set of conversations. A big thank you to the Bob Woodruff Foundation for supporting this program and all of you in the audience for joining us. For those of you who missed any conversations, these are conversations you ought to go back and listen to again and again and again. They'll all be on our website shortly. Join us tomorrow for a double header. We're going to talk small business at 11:30 a.m. Eastern, and then at 1:15 p.m. Eastern, it's time for the Vaccine Summit. Time for everything you wanted to know about the COVID vaccine, but didn't know who to ask. Dr. Anthony Fauci will be joining us, also Dr. Francis Collins, as well as many other fantastic speakers. Go to thehill.com/events to sign up. I'm Steve Clemons. Be well.